My name is Carolyn Campbell, and I'm a longtime friend of Pat's. And I'm honored to sort of act as almost MC or whatever for this evening. Most of you know that Jim died just a few months after he and Pat moved to BC, actually a few weeks. Many of us felt that loss very deeply and wanted an opportunity to come together and remember Jim and to send Pat, who is here on the phone with us, send Pat our love. So friends of Pat and members of BNS, Plummet and Natural Society, we worked together to organize this gathering. So I've known Pat for almost 40 years, but I didn't know Jim until she came into Pat's life. So it's been really interesting for me being part of organizing this because I've learned things about Jim that I never knew, which is really quite fun. One of them that I just got in an email today, and I should tell you that I've received at least 10 or 12 emails from people who aren't able to be here tonight, but I'll pass on the comments. But one thing that I just learned was that, for example, during his 40 years with BNS, he wrote how many articles for the newsletter? Take a guess. Anybody know? Pardon? All of them. 275. So, but there are other people here who can tell you more about that part of Jim's life. But the Jim that I knew was the Jim that brought devotion, love, and joy into Pat's life. They were very different people, but as their relationship developed, they found common ground, playing, learning, and growing together. Despite Pat's frustration with Jim's newspaper reading habits, their relationship was comforting and nourishing. The depth of Pat's grief she's feeling now is a testament to the depth of the love that they share. Loving Pat as I do, I could not help but also love the man who brought that to her life. Soren?
It's wonderful to see so many of you out there. And I think it's very appropriate that we are by the Roby Tucker Center because indeed Jim was very much a part of the Roby Tucker Center. And during the summer you would find him down here just about every evening counting swifts entering the chimney, and he would write the notes on a piece of paper that was taped to one of the plaques that used to be here. And as you can see, we're getting new plaques, and it's slowly coming back to life. Anyways, this is for Jim, and I was so happy when Caroline contacted me to see if we would be part of the celebration for Jim, because indeed it's a delight, that you asked me, and the BNS is very much, well, Jim was BNS in many ways, I think. Anyway, I came to Wolfville in 1989, and Jim at that time was the intro instructor in the Department of Biology, which I joined. And so the very first time I met Jim, I'm repeating something I said a few weeks ago when the Department of Biology celebrated Jim. But anyway, Jim sat in the front row listening to my presentation, my job presentation for the department. And what happened after about 10 minutes, he fell asleep. And I thought, oh my God, am I that boring? But as I learned through the years, Jim always fell asleep at talks. So this was not, something that he did because I was talking. And I also discovered that although he fell asleep, he always had questions. So clearly, somehow he was listening to what was going on. So maybe it was a ploy of him to sit there in the front row. And anyways, and just before he left, he came out to my place with a box full of notes and et cetera, that he had for the BNS. So I have all of his notes over the years in terms of equal counts and many other things. Well, you mentioned the newspaper habit that Jim had. I remember borrowing books from Jim on a variety of issues. When you opened them up, they were just scribbled full of his notes and underlines, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure that if you counted up all the words that he scribbled in his books, there were probably more than in the text itself. He just seemed to have to write prolifically in what he read. And if you would lend him something, it came back full of scribbles as well. So, anyway, Jim was wonderful, wonderful guy, and I'm so happy that when I learned that he was going to leave with Pat to go out west, that Caroline and I decided to do a podcast with him. And if you haven't listened to the podcast that we did, you can find it on the BNS website. And if you can't find it, contact me somehow and I'll send you the link. But it really is a wonderful, I think, 50-minute discussion with Jim about his life at Acadia, his life with the BNS, and about, you know, nature and et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things he lamented when we did the podcast with him, when we interviewed him, he said the vernal pond field trip to the Blominen Provincial Park had not been done in a number of years. So this spring, some of you may have been on that trip. Richard, I know you were on it. We kind of reinstituted the field trip to the vernal pond. And that, I think, was probably Jim's primary, or that was the highlight of field trips that he did. He did lots of field trips, but I think that particular field trip was something that he loved.
But it's difficult not to say something, because I knew Jim for more than half a century, and first met him as a graduate student. I was a graduate student, younger than he, in Alberta, and I very quickly realized that this was an extraordinary human being. I won't go into great detail about his qualities, because I have written a tribute to Jim, which is coming out in the BNS newsletter whenever it comes out, the fall edition. But there are several things that I think it's fair to say that none of us knew all of Jim. There were many dimensions to him, and those of us who were privileged enough to know him long enough to see some of them, there was always another dimension emerging as you got to know him.
Picking up the volume.
Jim had this extraordinary sense of wonder, and this is one of the things that
You can stand a little
all
closer
of you
and do
will
us.
remember.
Yeah,
He was childlike in that respect. He never lost that childlike sense of wonder, and he shared that willingly with anyone from 5 to 90, and with the same amount of energy and enthusiasm. He was an incredibly curious individual, and he was possibly the best naturalist that I've ever known. He certainly was probably one of the greatest observers that I ever knew, and one of his supervisors from Alberta, who's John Holmes, internationally acclaimed parasitologist, said that Jim was possibly the best observer he had ever met, and that says tons coming from a distinguished scientist, and he really was, and he could see the very small and the very large. Sometimes he'd miss one when he was busy looking at the other, but he was an extraordinary observer. The relationship, the first half of Jim's adult life, he spent largely living alone, except for cats. He had a number, and he had a special relationship with cats. But the second half of his adult life was transformed when he met Pat, and the impact that Pat had on Jim, I can't even begin to describe, but it was profound. And all of us who knew and loved Jim well could see that. It was instantly obvious that something very special had happened in Jim's life, and he was blessed, and he knew he was blessed. And so the second half of Jim's adult life was far richer and happier than the first half. I think there's no question in my mind. The last thing I'll say about about Jim is what a respectful individual he was. He had profound respect for everything living, all the organisms, and that was evident in the joy that he shared in exchanging knowledge and absorbing knowledge about other organisms. But he also had a tremendous amount of respect for his fellow humans. And many of you probably are not aware of just how important the social contracts were to Jim. And he lived, he walked the walk. He was extraordinarily generous, and his sense of social justice was profound. And many of the naturalist community never saw that because we're busy looking at non-humans, and we tend to try to minimize our interactions with other people and maximize our interactions with the interesting stuff, right? But Jim, he had the same respect for humans as he had for every other living organism on the planet, and I think it's important to recognize that's one of the special things about Jim, because there are few individuals for whom you can say that's true. Anyway, I will leave it there. I miss him extraordinarily. It was a privilege for me to know him, to spend time with him. I learned a tremendous amount from him, and Pat, we really miss you.
My name is Patrick Kelly. I met Jim from National Society on many, many field trips that he and Shirley Williams used to be together with Split. He had a really great sense of humor. It took him a little time to appreciate it, but given all the trips we had done together, he led a field trip up to Kingsport Beach. And going over marking up the cliffs, there was some cattails. And I pointed out to Jim and said, "That's odd to see bulrushes growing out there." And he looked at me with this really surprised look and said, "Those aren't bulrushes, they're cattails." And then I made the mistake. I said, "You mean they're not the same thing?"
Spouting about something probably of very little importance, but I thought it was important. And Jim, as usual, appeared to be asleep on one of the front chairs in the front row. But in the middle of what I was saying, he got up, came to the front, and started basically taking over from me. And I thought, what's going on here? And I didn't really know, but he gave a really good kind of spontaneous talk about what I was supposed to be saying. I don't know what it was. But anyway, I thought, well, I can't top this, so I went and sat down. And I didn't say anything. And when Jim had finished, he looked around. Everybody else looked around, I guess waiting for me to come back up or for him to say something or whatever. Nothing happened, and there was sort of complete silence for about a minute. And
The chimney swift count, as Solomon mentioned, he would stand here every night just about and count chimney swifts coming down into this chimney. And he annotated it, and he had all kinds of data about it. In touch with other people from represent Bird Studies Canada and so forth. And it preceded citizen science like eBird by a long, long way, and was basically just as good as could be done in those days. And the second similar thing was the eagle count. And he arranged the eagle count. He did it in a very good and scientific way. He published all the results, and it was just amazing. And I always remember going into the room there in Sheffield Mills, and he put up all this information up on the on the paper on the wall, and his notes and his comments and all his scribblings were there on the paper that we could add to them. And again, this was all stuff that was publishable and published and preceded the current citizen science projects that are well known birders anyway, by a long way, and was just made out.
my son owns a restaurant just around the corner there, which is currently non-functional because there was a fire.
Oh, yes.
But every Friday morning, Jim, without fail, would show up at the restaurant and order his breakfast. And after he went out west, Tom said to me one day, "What's happened to Jim? Has he died or something?" And I said, "No, he's just gone out west." And then
about 2 weeks later, indeed, he passed away. And that was kind of very poignant and ironic. But his presence in the restaurant certainly was enough to...
Hi, I'm Pauline. I didn't know Jim well, but I knew Pat quite well, and she was a dear friend, is a dear friend. We ended up buying their lovely home in Wolford, for which I'm grateful. And one of the things besides the view when you walked in the door were the 9 pheasants in the backyard at Jim's feeding station, and the 5 eagles overhead, almost like they knew, well, Jim would be moving, but there'd always be a welcome home for them. And what I did know of Jim was a very lovely man, and he will be missed.
I knew Jim because I was at Acadia University starting in 1976. Only I'm not going to talk about the biology department. I'm going to talk about something that Tom mentioned. Starting very early on, the faculty and staff and students formed a basketball league. We called it the NBA, the Noonhour Basketball Association. And we were members of it for well over 20 years. Jim played as one of the key people in it. He was one of the ones who started it, and we had some hilarious times. I still remember some of the things Tom talked about, Jim's sense of right and wrong. Well, he was the keeper of the rules. If you moved your foot an inch, you traveled, and he would let you know. Jim also had a temper. Most of it came out with the other big guy on the other team. It was always Jim on one team, and Bob McCarthy on the other team, and the two of them had elements.
This will be short and sweet. Pat will appreciate it. Thank you, Gary, for mentioning Jim's temper. I was lucky enough to be on one of the field trips out to Cape Split. And actually, I was at the end of the line, and I wasn't really overly taken with what was being said. The person beside me, and we were having a great conversation, and all of a sudden one heard, "Quiet, quiet back there, please, quiet." And so we stopped, and then a couple steps, and we started up again, and we were good friends, and we were having a great conversation. I said, "Quiet, quiet back there." Well, finally, when he finally yelled for about the 4th time and looked back, it was Pat and myself that were chatting at the back of the line. Jim very quickly had these eyes that the eyebrows just sort of looked back at Pat laughing, that looked down at Pat and looked at me, and we very sheepishly put our heads down, and we never said another word.
I knew Jim in a number of overlapping roles over the years. I think I first met him about probably 30 years ago when I was working for an environmental sciences consulting company, and I always called Jim to double check what Lands and Forests was telling me about species distribution and all that sort of thing. He was my go-to. Are they piling a whole lot of crap on me, or is this actually real? And he was always such a help. And I went to work for Ecology Action Center running the forestry campaign with Mingo O'Brien, and Jim was one of our key advisors. He was a mentor, he was a friend, and there's a big Jim-shaped hole now, I think, in a lot of our lives. It's been a rough summer, and the loss of Jim is one of the roughest bits. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Glennis, and some of you may know me from the biology department. I just want to have a couple of words. I'll be really quick about Jim. I took a number of courses from him. First year biology, which is completely intimidating. As you might imagine, he knew everything, so keeping up with that was a challenge. Not that we did. But my favorite course I took from him was field biology here on campus, and we went to Kingsport Beach, and we went out to Salt Marsh, we went out to all sorts of places in the area. And now every time I walk those trails or I go to Kingsport Beach, I
have these places where I go to and I see Jim. And it's this wonderful legacy. I learned so much from him, and it's very nice to be able to walk around in these areas and still have that connection.
Jim decided to go. That was a big deal. And anyway, Jim was pretty excited about certain things and the birds, all the wonderful things that they were going to do out there. And the night before they left, they popped over and had a little drink and a couple of Edie's and stuff. And he and David were chatting about the fact that Jim could sing, and we all knew that he was, what was he anyway when he was in university? He was on the he was playing an instrument but also playing football. And so at halftime, when all the people, David, you should be telling this story, you're better at it than me. Anyway, in his football uniform, he would go out, and what did he play? I can't remember, but what was it? Okay. And anyway, I was always enchanted by that. But so he and David were chatting on the last night, and he looked wonderful, Jim did. He had a great jacket.
I cannot picture him playing basketball.
He was well, Jim was a great athlete. He used to play softball and he was very serious. He was a great golfer. He played squash. Oh yeah, no, he was quite nice. Every night I go back.
Hi, so much. I love you, Pat. So much.